got your slab and you've put your plate in a mold. In our case, we're just using a paper plate, and we waited until our clay got to the leather hard stage. You could technically, I guess, help it out with a heat gun or a hairdryer, but if you do that, you're going to run the risk of warping your slab. And so that's just not a great idea, but if you are crunched on time, that might be your only choice. But it's better to just kind of let it naturally dry and get to that leather hard stage if you can do that. So you've already cut out your snowflake, and hopefully you have made an effort to have equal negative and positive space. So meaning where the shape is cut out, that's going to be our negative space, and where the paper is, that's going to be our positive space. And we want to set this on our plate to act as our barrier between the clay and the underglaze. But obviously, if we just put it on there like this, it's going to curl up on us. So what we're going to do is we're going to just lightly spray our snowflake, and try not to get water on your plate right now. If we need to, we might have to put some water on the plate with a sponge, but right now we're just going to put some water on the snowflake itself. And be careful, because your paper is probably going to be pretty brittle at this point once you put some water on it. And you can see that mine is curling up just slightly. So very gently go back through, start in the middle, and press your paper onto your clay. And technically you could spray the clay itself, but a lot of times beginners end up spraying the clay too much, and then they run into other problems. So that's why I always have beginners spray the paper. But if you feel like that's going to be challenging, then maybe have them spray the clay. And then I'm going to take my damp sponge, and I'm just going to kind of go over it just to make sure that it is all the way pressed down onto the clay, and there's no kind of peeling back of the paper. And I've had students lay down an underglaze first and then put their stencil and then put a different color underglaze on top. So you could do that if you have the time. In our case, we're just going to have wherever the paper is, that's going to be white. So I have my underglaze here, so I've already stirred it, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it in a tray just so I don't get glaze on the handle of my paintbrush. I think it just makes it a little bit easier. I say that, but then I got it all over my fingers. So I don't really need that much, but that's okay. We'll just pour it back into the jar. And then I like to have my bristles to my paintbrush already wet. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply my first layer of underglaze, starting in the middle, and I'm going to work my way out. And remember that underglaze does not have glass in it. It doesn't have flux. So the brush strokes that you see are not going to melt. So once you get a layer on here, it's really not a great idea to go back over your underglaze too much, but we also don't want these brush strokes to show up. But you have to be careful with your paper too, because you don't want to peel it up and mess up the snowflake design. So once you get a layer down, then you can kind of just go back over and even out your brush strokes. We are going to glaze the backside, so go ahead and do the rim. And this isn't the best brush for underglaze. I should probably be using a softer bristled brush. but it's the one that I grabbed. So at this point, we're going to let our underglaze dry, and we'll come back and we'll put another layer on it after it is not shiny and completely dry. Okie dokie, so before we go to the second layer, I want you to go ahead and just go through and make sure that your snowflake paper is still flat against your clay. And if it's not, just kind of gently press it down. I did have one spot, which I did just fix, but you want to make sure that that is still flat against your clay, because if not, then your underglaze is going to seep underneath it. So for our second layer, I switched to a softer brush. If you have a fan brush, if you have access to a fan brush, that's really going to be your best bet. I don't have any right here at my recording table, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this one. It's just got softer bristles, so it should clean up any of these brush strokes. And I've already stirred up my glaze. The other thing that could make this easier for you is if you put your plate on a turntable. That could essentially help you get an even brush stroke all the way around, because then you can use your turntable to your advantage. So again, starting in the middle and just kind of turning your plate here as we go. And we'll come back in and we'll even that out in just a second. Just like that. But like I said, underglaze, you really don't want to continuously re-brush the areas that you've already laid down glaze, because then all you're doing is picking it back up. So try to kind of avoid that and do that as sparingly as you can. But you don't want to leave, heavy brush strokes either, because those will show up in your fire. So just kind of go back through and clean that up just a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the side. And I'm going to let that dry. Okay, so I am only going to put 2 layers of the black underglaze on my plate, because that underglaze was really thick, probably because I left it out. But if your underglaze was a little bit thinner, then you definitely want to put another layer, so a total of 3. But I'm going to leave mine at 2 just because of the thickness of the underglaze. I'm ready to pull my snowflake template off of my plate, so I have my X-Acto knife here. So I'm going to really carefully lift one corner and pull. And it's not a big deal if it rips, because you're not going to be able to reuse this template anyway, because it's got all that underglaze on it, and it would be too brittle. So take your time as you're pulling this off. You do want to make sure that your underglaze is all the way dry. That way you don't smear it onto your leather hard clay. If you have an area where your underglaze bled underneath the template of your snowflake design, it's not a huge deal. It doesn't mean that your design is messed up. It just means that you'll have a little bit of cleanup to do here when we get this all the way off. My underglaze is still, or the paper is still a little bit wet, so that's why this is tearing a little bit. So if you wanted to wait longer than I have, then you could probably get your paper off a little bit easier than what it's going for me. And there we go. We have our fantastic snowflake design on our plate. And I'm gonna let this dry just a little bit more, and then I'll go in and I'll clean up the areas where the underglaze bled into my template design. For today, you obviously need your plate design, your turntable. You're going to use your loop tool, your big one. Well, this isn't a big one, it's kind of medium size. And we want the one that's got a little bit of width to it. So we don't want that super skinny one. We want the one that's got, I don't know, just a little bit of metal between them. What you do not want to use is your needle tool. We are not using this tool today. If you use this, you're going to create lines in your designs and you're going to end up like taking clay out. So avoid using that. I always see beginners using it and you don't want to. And then you're probably going to end up using your X-Acto knife the most. This is what you'll see me using most of the time during this video clip. And then you may need a small brush and a little cup of water, but this will probably depend on if you need to clean up any of the clay, if it gets kind of some rough marks or some carving marks. Sometimes you can clean it up with a paintbrush without messing up the actual design. So you don't necessarily have to have this, but it's just an option that I'll show you in case you run into that problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our clay slab that's going to be our plate. We're going to take it out of the paper plate mold, and your paper plate is probably pretty moist at this point. You can't reuse it, it's pretty floppy because it's taken some of the moisture out of your slab and it's absorbed it. So you can just toss that aside, recycle it, and place your plate design on your turntable. So that way it makes it just easier to work on. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm either going to use my X-Acto knife or my loop tool to go in and fix up any of these marks where that underglaze got underneath my template. So you can see in some areas I've just got a little bit of underglaze that kind of went underneath there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm going to really carefully just scrape that glaze off. So I'm not pressing into the clay. I'm literally just scraping the glaze. So avoid putting pressure down on the clay itself. It's a really, really gentle touch. And it's a little bit hard to kind of hold it like a pencil. Normally I'm always kind of telling beginners, hold your tools like you would a pencil, but it gets a little bit difficult just because of the shape of the plate. So it might be a little bit easier just to hold it out slightly. However, if you don't have any control, then go back to holding it down closer to the blade. That way it doesn't, start to move around too much on you. So I'm just gonna go through and I'm gonna clean up all of this extra underglaze, and notice that I'm wiping that underglaze off my blade every time, because if not, you're just going to end up moving it around. And you could use a paper towel to do that. I'm just using my fingers, but if you want to use a paper towel, you can. So you'll just continue this process, and I like to work from the middle out. That way I can keep track of the areas of my plate that I have completed and the areas that I still need to work on. Remember to go slow, take your time. It's all about the pressure and your sense of touch. my design kind of cleaned up as best as I can do without messing the whole design up, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to clean up little pieces of the clay that maybe I just carved out a little bit too much. Maybe I lost my patience or my attention span, or maybe just my knife slipped or my carving tool slipped, and so I took out a little bit too much clay. So you can kind of see right there on that spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a really small brush and I'm going to get it wet, and I'm going to make sure that once I get it wet, I'm going to put it on some paper towel just to get rid of some of that water, because I don't want a whole lot of water on my plate. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to that section and I'm just going to really gently kind of smooth that out with my paintbrush. Avoid the underglaze though, and if you get some clay built up on your brush, just kind of wipe it off. And then just kind of continue that really gentle process, staying on the clay, avoiding the underglaze until it gets smoothed out. So anywhere you have that happening, go ahead and do that. Just go slow, be careful. That was the only spot that I had. So my plate is actually almost finished. I'm going to do just a little bit more touch up with some underglaze. So that's the step that I will show you next. Now that my design's cleaned up, I'm going to go in with my underglaze and a super tall, tiny small brush, and I'm going to go and clean anything up that might need it. And I really don't have too much happening on mine that needs a lot of cleanup, but I do have one spot, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So very carefully, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to just try to line up those lines where it got just slightly too much clay or underglaze taken off of there. And you're going to do that all the way around wherever you might need to do some touch-ups. Avoid overglazing the whole thing though, because you would definitely see a color change because the clay is a different color, and you probably won't be able to get your underglaze exactly even with the underglaze that's already on there. In this next segment, once you have your plate cleaned up, you're going to want to grab your saran wrap, and we're going to put that down on your table or your project board or wherever your work surface is. You're going to set that down before we do anything else with our plate. Sometimes I'll get messages asking if you can use paper towel for this or a piece of paper, and you can, but the problem is if your clay still has a lot of moisture in it, then that paper towel or paper could potentially stick. And what we're doing is we're going to flip our plate over, and you're going to see the paper here, and you don't want that paper sticking to the front of your nice design because it would mess it all up. My slab had an awful lot of moisture in it when I set it in that paper plate, which is why this occurred. You can put saran wrap down on the paper plate before you lay your slab in there, but I find for beginners that the saran wrap tends to kind of get in the way, and they get more focused on that rather than concentrating on the slab. So we can clean this up really easily once you have everything else done. But if you want to avoid this completely, just put saran wrap down on your plate before you put your slab. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take my damp sponge and I'm just going to wet my clay here. I'm just going to get my paper wet and my sponge, and that's just to kind of help loosen this up. And what I'm going to do is sometimes you can just use your X-Acto knife and you can just peel this right up. But sometimes it doesn't all come, so then we're going to go back in with our scraper and we're going to scrape it off. And some of you might not have this on your plate. This rarely happens to me. Not really sure why that occurred. It might be the paper plate that I use. A lot of times I'll use a more sturdy paper plate, but the one that I had was what I had access to real quick, so that's the one I grabbed. So that was probably the problem. So I'm just really gently taking that paper off. It's okay if you get little scrapes from your X-Acto knife. It's not a huge deal. We can clean that up here in a little bit. But you know, if you work in clay long enough, you kind of run into these problems like this. And it's just problem solving through it, and how do you fix it? Most of the time there's an answer. You just have to kind of experiment and figure out what will work. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my metal scraper and I'm just going to gently scrape the rest of this paper off. And it's not like we have to get every single bit of it, because it's going to burn away in the kiln, but it could potentially leave little marks on your plate. So that's why you want to try to clean it up, especially, you know, if you're going to give this away as a gift. Plus it's just a good habit to get into, to have quality work rather than mediocre work. You know, set your standards high, don't set them low. Like I said, you can go back in and you can kind of loosen that paper up a little bit to get that out of there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my time and I'm going to go ahead and get all of this off of the back side of my plate. Okay, so now that I have all the paper off of the back side of my plate, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish cleaning this up. So you can see that there's underlays on the under rim of my plate, and I want to get rid of that because I'm going to do a different color here. So I'm going to take my scraper and I'm going to use the rounded edge, and I'm going to very gently scrape that underglaze off, sort of like I did the paper, but you don't have to use as heavy of a touch, I guess. It's a little bit lighter than what I was pressing with when I was trying to get that paper off. And you could probably even use your sponge to do this, but what I'm also doing is, if you had a rough edge on the rim of your plate, this is going to clean that up. Because we never took our slab back off the plate mold, and so the chances of you having kind of this rough edge here on the bottom is pretty likely. Just again, it's a really light touch. I'm not pressing really hard. And then once you've gone all the way around, if you have any spots where maybe that paper, those marks from the X-Acto knife or the rib are kind of showing up, now's the time to kind of smooth that stuff in as well. You can just kind of use the curved part of your scraper to help smooth those items in. My clay is still leather hard, so it definitely has the ability to kind of smooth all of this out. If your clay has moved in to the greenware stage, then you're probably, you're a little bit out of luck, and you're really kind of playing with fire, because you could potentially break your plate. So I'm just going to go in with my finger and I'm just going to round out this edge. Make sure that it has some moisture in it. That just helps smooth out that edge. And for me, for my final step, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a color to the back of my plate. But if you just want it to be bisqueware, if you want it to be kind of it won't be pure white because we're not using a porcelain, we're using a low fire underglaze. So it's going to be kind of more of a cream color. But if you're okay with that, then you can leave it, and it will be the color of the bisque. We'll still go ahead and put a clear coat on it, so you're able to use it. But I'm going to go ahead and put a color on the back of mine. I'm going to come through and I am going going to fix up the rim where I might have got a little bit of the color from underneath on the side, and if I have any of my clay showing. So I'm going to use my underglaze black to go ahead and finish that. Once that's finished, then we're going to set up our plate to dry, and then when it's all the way fired, we will go ahead and, I'm sorry, when it's all the way dry, we will go ahead and fire it for the first time.